But all of it winds up, they wind here. And Moses got to see the promised land, but he never got to cross into it. But so what we're looking at in the book of Deuteronomy is called the second law, the law of Moses, was the fact that they were for this, and it's one of the most inspiring books to be able to read when you realize what Moses was really saying. And I love the way Mark put it together, and he does a good job. But this is what I want you to look at. From here to here is 11-day hike. The way they made it was 40 years. You see, I know about being in the wilderness for 40 years, all right? You come back and sit back down and listen to the Lord. 40 years, I was 13 years old when the Lord called me, all right? I was in one of the revivals that we were doing, and his mother and all of us, but anyway, I was 13. And Joe, I can tell you, I was 53 when I went into the ministry. So Moses has nothing on me. I don't know what that's supposed to mean unless God says, so you didn't have sense enough either. But now that you want to cross into the promised land, you got to change some things. So I know what it's like. But anyway, when you think about it, think about your class reunions. How many of you think back on your classes? You ever been back? How many of you have scrapbooks? And what do you do when you go through scrapbooks? All of a sudden, memories start flying. And this is what really and truly is transpiring if you read this, all right? Are you familiar songs? You know what? I woke up the other day, I was after the Super Bowl the next morning, and I was awakened to the national anthem. Why? I don't know why, but anyway, this is what it was. And this morning, I was awakened with Great Is Our Faithfulness, all right? So you have all these crazy earworms in our life. But there's a lot of memories. Joy and I were looking at pictures and thinking about things, and all of a sudden we remember. When you look at it, you remember things because you'll see, oh, I do remember that. So that's what happened. That's scrapbooks. There are familiar songs to us. And this is what Deuteronomy is going to be wound up doing for us. Or the long-time friendships that awaken memories from a lot of us when we think of it. It's sort of like, remember looking at a kaleidoscope and how you turn it? You see, it's sort of like the book of Deuteronomy to me is a kaleidoscope of promises from God, all right? And it's also the failure of the people. It's all in the kaleidoscope. And it's also the victories that occurred in all of this. You're going to find this out. Now, we're not going to take the book of Deuteronomy chapter by chapter. We're going to take some of it. If you've seen the book, we're going to do it. We could, all right? But we'll be here for a while, all right? Yeah. And I like the way Mark is putting it together. 40 years. In 40 years, that's right. Or it's also you get to thinking about things like that. Do you remember embarrassments?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you think that you got them out of the way, but all of a sudden something occurs and that sort of thing happens. But anyway, when we think about it, but sometimes what you want to forget memories, and can you imagine the Israelites there standing and, they wanted to forget what they'd gone through, all right? 40 years of this. Can you imagine how many of them were born in a tent? And now they're the ones that's getting ready to lead. Joshua was born in the wilderness, all right? And then he and Caleb, and we're going to hear about them. But anyway, as years passed and remembrances and unpleasant events, they usually begin to fade away in our lives. And so when you think about those unpleasant times, there's a time to remember those, right? And this is what Deuteronomy and what Moses is saying to the Israelites. There's a time to remember. You remember how bad it was and how bad it didn't work, but this is God do it. So when you think about it, mistakes should not repeat themselves, right?
They hope not.
But sometimes they do, and commitments that must be fulfilled, and memories of all sorts of special events can encourage us to move to action. And this is what Moses was saying to them. We're going to find out. He was encouraging them, and you're going to see that. But the book of Deuteronomy is written in a way, it's sort of a form of a treaty. When you think about it, it's sort of a treaty between a king and his vassal state, all right? And then so this is where, when you think about it in that respect, But you got to realize something, that it was written, 2 millenniums before Christ? That's a long time. And yet it had enough that the Jewish faith and the Christian faith says, wait a minute, this is important. This is some of those things. So it was part of, as I said, it was part of the Torah. And it calls Israel, and it calls us today to remember who God is and what God has done in our lives. And that's important for us as we look at this. Because you think about it, and you ever had a lack of faith? I'm not talking about a lack of faith in God, sorry. I'm talking about have you had a lack of faith in anything around, or you wasn't sure I had faith in this is going to work or it's not going to work. You see, the old generation that wandered for 40 years in the wilderness and died in the desert, all right? A lot of them were buried out across there. How many people do you think? I think Mark says there were 1 million, right? I had never really thought about the number, but can you imagine Moses handling 1 million to 2 million people, and all of them not getting along with ideas? And to me, Joshua and Moses both had a lot of political tactness about them. They were able to they had diplomacy, they could handle it at times. But I think at times they got pretty put out. But they left Egypt behind, as I said earlier, and never knew the promised land. In other words, they wandered in that wilderness for 40 years and never got to the promised land. I sometimes think that maybe I'm not quite there, but Billy Graham, maybe Johnny and Matheson wrote something this morning, and it sort of hit me right between the eyes, and I thought, well, okay, Lord, I'm listening. And so, but here they are, and on the east, they wound up on the east bank. Do you realize what that area over there is? That's Edomites, all right? That's Esau's folks. You remember the twins? And so the Edomites was over, that's Edom, over that side, all right? And so we were there. And so when we look at it, Moses, as we look at this, is going to be reviewing the law. And then he's going to restate the covenant God connected with his people. And that's something, it's still important for us today. We need to still be connected in that covenant. And so as we go through this, I hope the lessons become clear, because what God has done, what he did for the Israelites, what he can do for us, there's hope to be following. And they found that out. They found that out once the generation rest crossed over, and they found out really and truly what God promises can do. And so there's some learning lessons that prepared them in the promised land. You got to realize God was really preparing them for the 40 years, because he had to take care of those that were not going to get done, but they needed to get done. And so it was there. So as you and I hear this message from Deuteronomy and lessons that come from it, I want us to think about, remember how God has expressed his kindness in each of our lives. Have you ever, think about that for a fact being his, and remember that. And then it's important for us, as we remember it, to recommit ourselves anew to trust the Lord, all right, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your whole soul, and all your strength, and also to commit ourselves to obey him. That's the important thing. And that's what Moses was saying. How many of you have read any of it yet? Have you read it? Well, I got to thinking about some of this and thinking along those lines. But I love the way he puts it in here. It's reckless abandon, and we think of the rest as abandon. But the book also, for us, is an outstanding importance in the development of our Christian life. And I'm hoping that's what we find as we do this study. We have that. Because you see, you realize that the Lord Jesus Christ quoted from a lot of this, all right? And we can go back and look at it. And so there were recognizable passages that he used. And it's important for us this day to think about what Moses has said and what he is saying now. In other words, as we look at this, think about Moses standing here talking to us as he talked to the Israelites at that time in their lives. And so it was interesting. Thoughts? Those of you who have taken a few moments and read some of it, I wondered what your thoughts were. I can identify with him. How many of you watched the football game? The Super Bowl? On the kickoff, what happens to some of the kickoff teams? What do? You ever watch they run with reckless abandonment all the way down? And some of them wind up the ball goes through the end zone, but they're still running and they run through the end zone. So really and truly, I like to talk about it because I don't know about the rest of it, but I always wanted to get that first lick after the kickoff. In other words, then your adrenaline starts flowing, and then you're into it. You say, oh, that wasn't too bad, And so you have to get that going. So what is reckless abandon?
No worries. Yeah, you just.
No worries.
Intentionally setting aside your worries.
Do what?
Intentionally setting aside your worries.
Yeah.
Intentionally, okay.
Well, it says it's a foolhardy approach, so I mean, it could be.
Is it what?
A foolhardy approach to something, reckless abandon.
Yeah.
Could be.
Says something.
Yeah.
I like the part that he brought out. I remembered reading it where Newt Rockme got the Notre Dame team so excited they ran out of the locker room and run into the swimming pool. And one of my favorites, he quoted one of my favorites, and that's Churchill, and thinking of where it transpired there. So when you realize that we're looking at this, it's truly, as we read this, we're going to find this an inspirational speech. And Deuteronomy means the double law, the second law. But he led, I like the way that Mark puts it in. He put it bewildering, million strong Israelites marching through the wilderness. And I don't think they marched. I think they sort of meandered. In the days of saying, I don't have any food, I don't have any water, I don't this sort of thing. Come in, Sue, pull up a chair, it's never too late. But what did you think of when you were looking at this? In your experience prior to today, have you ever given much thought to what transpired in that 40 years in the wilderness? Have you ever, other than the fact being the Bible said they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, have you really ever thought about what really transpired for 40 years? You realize there were a lot of babies born. There were a lot of burials going on.
A bunch of funerals.
And all of that was going on. And so think about what's occurred in your life in 40 years.
Work.
Oh, what?
My work.
Your work, all right.
I figured out like that.
But when you think about
45 years.
But 40 years is, what's 4 decades? And I remember when our children first started getting 40 and beyond. And you think about it, Joy and I have not quite made 40 years in the ministry. We're close. I'm praying that the Lord lets me continue till maybe I do get 4 decades in the ministry. I don't know. I was interested. One of my heroes is Cy Matheson. He didn't get into ministry; he was an older man. But when he was 90 years old, he started a church on the beach in Florida, and now the church has got like 600 or 700 members. And then by 96, the Lord says, okay, Si, it's time to come home. And so he did. But when you think of that, and what can be accomplished, you're never too old. All right. Sometimes we think we are, don't we? And so I find that I don't know how you are, but as I get older, I don't walk as good as I used to walk. Do you? But the major thing is I find out I don't pick up my feet.
That's the problem.
Can you imagine walking through the wilderness and not picking up your feet? You're going to stumble and break some things there. So this first generation lived in slavery. As I said earlier, in the time frame that we're looking at, Joseph died 400 years before they were able to have the exodus out of Egypt. So that was 400 years, all right? And we've read about that at night. And then do you realize what transpired immediately right after that? Within a few years, or within a year, Moses was on the mountain with the Lord, Mount Sinai. What happened? He got the 10 Commandments that was handed to him. As a matter of fact, Deuteronomy, we'll have the 10 Commandments in the 20th chapter. like in Exodus 11 in the 5th chapter, or maybe it's the other way around, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. But anyway, those are, that came about. What do you think happened when they saw Moses with his face all red and had his experience with God?
Scared to death.
And I'm sure. But that's the same thing, and we're going to find that out as we go through this and think about this book of Deuteronomy. You're going to find Moses, we're going to carry it all the way up to Moses' death, and then you're going to find that's where the judges came in, or after that, the Roman. So that was there. So the theme of the book of Deuteronomy really and truly is renewing the mighty acts of God, whereby he liberated the Israelites from slavery. And see, that's the thing that we don't hear a lot about. Slavery has been going on in the world from the beginning. Right? I would love for it to have not been there, but it was there. And it is, it's something. And he recounted, and I'm saying we're going to recount what's happened. But important for you and me is, I want us to review God's promise and the mighty acts of his. It's important for us to, I can come and preach, or Mark can do it, or Candy can do it, or any of them go on a Sunday morning and bring you all these stories. But do we really get to feel the gospel that's coming about? And what transpired bringing the gospel about is the book of Deuteronomy and the other books of the Old Testament. All right? They're important for us to think of that. And so what we can learn from that. And in this book we're going to find the laws, we're going to find love of God, we're going to find choices to make, like the Israelites had choices and didn't take some they should have. And we're going to find teachings throughout the book of Deuteronomy that gives us things. And, how many of you know really and truly or believe in the commitment of God to us?
Absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm getting all nods. Everybody does. But then can you imagine a generation, 40 years, of really not paying a lot of attention to that commitment that God? That means to me is, you said this, God, but I don't believe you.
Well, I haven't always
That's-
had
Do what?
I haven't always believed that God was committed to me. I mean, I wandered too.
Well, and that's true, and a lot of us, but I think subliminally we do.
Well, I believe, but
Yeah.
it
We
was just
think
kind
of
of like you said,
Yeah,
it's back
right,
here in
no.
the background. not
It's
really.
an
But you
intellectual
gotta really-
belief versus an emotional belief. is what
Yeah,
you're saying.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's sort of like the laws that we're going to be reading about. Each generation, each person must respond afresh. In other words, I can't do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. To God's call to obedience. And that's what you finally found, is that I always didn't believe in. When I was at LSU, Joe, I can tell you, I had a priest that I dealt with in the Lady Lake Hospital where I worked, and I argued with him quite a bit. Well, later he became a bishop.
I feel sorry for him.
He came walking down the hall. I'm there. I'm a lab tech. I've been in the room getting. He came walking down the hall. Jordan. It was just before we moved to Little Rock. And he looked and he said, "Hey, Marvel, are you still going to die and go to hell?" Because I'd argue with him. The fact being is, but I get fun out of doing that. Do you?
Sure.
I like to take the get 180 degrees out of phase and get into a debate. But I did that in seminary. I had a couple of professors that wanted to throw books at me. But the fact being is, to me, that's a challenge. In other words, it's a challenge to me. When I start questioning, I'm really and truly proving back to me what I believe. All right, I believe in the commitment that God has made, and it's important for us. And I want to be obedient to Him. You see, God's love, and this is we're going to find out in Deuteronomy. Also, you're going to find a lot of it out as we go through Mark's book here. Love forms the foundation for our trusting. That's exactly where it comes from, and that's how we get it. And so we have that trust in Him. And, we trust God because, why? He loves us, right? And that's the thing about it is that we have, because God loves us, and you and I need to maintain in our lives the justice and respect of those around us, you know. But there are choices that are going to be made. There's going to be a lot of choices that we're going to see here. We're going to hear Mark talk about the choices that the generation test didn't do, or they chose not to do it. And then he's also saying, okay, generation rest. Here you are. You're on the east side of the Jordan. It's time for you to cross over and take the promised land. Y'all remember the story. They sent spies in and sent 10 in, and 2 came back and said, 8 of them said, oh, well, they're giants, we can't do it. And the other 2, Caleb and Joshua, said, oh, yeah, we can. But then also, you're going to find where Moses takes and puts Joshua in the head of the Israelites. So we see God's work in all of this. And so we have to make choices, and that's where it was. But I hope that we can find out of this, that we get we enlarge our relationship. I think that's the right word. Strengthen the word. Our relationship with God. The more we delve into God's word, to me, I don't know how it does for you, but for me, it strengthens my relationship with God. And I said, lead on, O King, and we get into that. But choosing to abandon God's ways brings harm to us, and we see it. We've seen it with people, all right? We see that, think of the tragedy that happened to the family down at Glen Rose, all right? And I don't know if you know about it, it touches the church. But anyway, when you think of that, and it's like talking to a young man before Christmas program one night, and I said, come on in. No, I can't go in there. I can't go in there. In other words, and he was saying, the devil says to him, you can't go in, and he's not going to go. And so we have choices that we make, and we bring them upon ourselves. So the quality of I pray that we teach our children, but must be a priority. You've all been parents, and you've had to say, okay, yeah, you want to do this, you want to do this, but what is the proper thing to do? What priorities do you have? And those are the things. But God declared our desires that His truth be in our hearts. And I think we're going to find that out as we do this book, all right? And it's going to also be in our minds and in our spirit, and not merely in our traditions. In other words, if somebody asks you right on the street, what is your denomination? What do you say?
It doesn't matter.
That's right. I think the major thing is I'm Christian.
Yes.
All right? We don't need to get into I'm Baptist or I'm Methodist or I'm Episcopalian. I'm a child of God. I don't care where we stand in our lives. In other words, when I'm sitting across from people, and I've been in front of one with some confrontations and everything, the thing I want them to understand is I love you, and there's really nothing you can do about it because you're a child of God. And if God loves you, then I am required. And my faith says yes, so we love him. So here, that's where we are, thinking about it. And I want us to, any thoughts?
But that reminds me, my mom grew up Shinto.
All right.
And then she became Methodist.
Yeah.
And I asked her one time, I said, was it hard converting from Shinto to Methodist? And she looked at me like I just grew 2 heads or something. She said, Lola, only one God, doesn't matter what you call him.
Well, and that's very true. And you just saw something. There was a tremendous amount, and I read a story, I'm trying to remember where it was, a group of missionaries that went into Japan, and how the Christian faith absolutely grew like crazy. And most of them were Shintos before they came.
Well, that's what
before they were there. And that was interesting that you said that. I had forgot about that. And when you look at that and think about it, we're the largest Methodist church, or the largest Christian church in the world. Seoul, Korea. The largest Christian church. When you think of that. So look at the moments of two generations. How many generations is in your family?
Right.
How many?
3.
3.
2.
How many of you dig into Ancestry? Or My 23 or whatever it is, all right? So how many generations?
Oh, well.
And the family trees get crazy, all right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine what the family tree would look like of these million or so that are running, how many generations? Now, I realize we say 40 years is a generation, right? That's what most of us call a generation, is 40 years, and that's what's there. But when I'm thinking about, this first generation, they lived in Egypt. They saw the plagues, all right? By the way, did y'all see what just happened in Washington State?
In Washington State.
Yeah,
No.
bubonic plague.
Oh.
No, how many?
One person, and he got it from his cat.
Blame it on the cat.
Well, no, they said the cat had symptoms of it, It was in the news just the last day or so.
Haven't seen
How
it.
many years has it been since bubonic plague has been around?
A long time.
Let's see, yeah.
I pray we have the medications and everything to fight it. But thinking
I
about
don't know.
after all these generations of people that lived in Egypt just as their grandparents had, and Egypt, can you imagine how many, 40 years is what, 10 generations? If we give them 400 years, we give them 40 years, that's 10 generations, 10, from that time. Now, I'm looking at my timeline across here, and all of a sudden it goes from Joseph to the Exodus. It's 400 years. There's nothing in between there, it's sort of like, but something did actually had to transpire, because Moses writes about it. But this is, as Mark tells us, a generation of adults that struggle greatly with God's promise. But once out of Egypt, what happened? Why are we out here? We don't have any food. We don't have any water. Let's go back. We're better off where we were. Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
Can you go back? I don't think we can. I think I had a comment asked of me in the hospital yesterday. What's going to transpire in our world? And all of a sudden, the conversation got deep. I'm going to go, well, I really and truly think I think we have, it's like this generation rest that he calls. I feel like we have a generation rest that's getting ready to rise and take situations back and get us in some sensibility.
Hope so.
Yeah.
I praise him. But you know what, you and I could never really work our way out of the wilderness, can we? You ever been being in the wilderness? Where were you before you walked to the altar and said, "Here I am, Lord"? Do you remember doing that?
Not too much.
Do I?
Not as an infant, of course.
Oh, no, but that's another question. We in the Methodist Church baptize infants, children, under 12, all right? And that's a baptism. It isn't a christening, it's a baptism, all right? And I have to, as a minister, ask the young people that are becoming confirmants in the church, I have to ask them this question: do you believe in the baptism your parents took for you? And they have two choices, yes or no, all right? If they say yes, then they don't have to be baptized again, because we believe one baptism, one Lord, all right? And so you never, of course, now Joy and I were out of the church where they did baptisms right and left, I had a class of confirmants of teenagers, and we used a members pool, and I was baptizing them, all right? All of a sudden, I had 30 people in the pool wanting to be baptized. I mean, it was, the Spirit was there, but we have some denominations that says, well, we don't accept your baptism. But it isn't our choice, it's the Lord's, and that's why we take one Lord, one baptism. But that's where we are, the entire generation. I love what he said. I cracked up. I mean, when I read that, I thought, that whole generation went into the ditch. And think about that. Have you ever gone in the ditch? Have you ever gone off the road and wound up in the ditch?
Yes.
I did. I left Joy one night on the way home to the cow, and she put me off in the ditch and tore up the car too. But The thing about being in the ditch, I thought it was interesting, or they got into the weeds. You ever been in the weeds?
Yeah.
And so they're way, to the promised land. And so he's calling them, that those who went through the wilderness, they called them the wilderness, the generation test. In other words, but the second generation he called, and I don't understand, Mark, in your reading, did you figure out why he called it the generation rest?
I haven't gotten far enough in my reading of the book,
Oh,
but
I was just curious.
I can speculate that probably he was talking about the fact that they had a time of
Yeah.
relative peace
Yeah.
shortly after crossing over before things started getting haywire again.
But this second generation are who Moses is addressing in the book of Deuteronomy. He's giving them the speech that Deuteronomy gave. He was giving them the speech that Churchill gave to England, and so he's giving them that speech, and inspired them. And he says, utilize reckless abandon. What does that mean to you?
Dive in.
Dive in, look back, don't, and just take off, But the first generation, those in the 40 years in the wilderness, were not able. They were incapable of doing what God wanted done, and so that was where they were. So put a word in there. I'm gonna throw the word out to you. Onomatopoeia. You know what that is? That's where a word is like it sounds, like slap or lap or clap or what's the other one I was thinking of?
Bang.
Pitter patter.
Bang.
Bang, yeah. And so he used that, and I thought it was interesting that the second law was that it was almost like it was sounding like it was doing it. In other words, it was sort of those onomatopoeia that the sound, that may sound boring, but it really is that you don't know it, but the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to find out, is renowned for its ability to inspire. Now, when you think of inspiration in the Christian faith, what do you think? The Gospels,
Yeah.
Paul's letters. You think of those, right? But you never stop to think, but whoa, the book of Deuteronomy is going to inspire me to be a better Christian? But I think it's going to find out that we are. It's going to encourage this, as it encouraged the generation of rest, it's going to encourage us as we delve into it and do it. So somebody look up 2 Kings 22:8. You got it right there? I have it on my phone, but you can put it on. That was an interesting thing. I have my Bible on my phone now. Do you? Joe and I went to one of the churches with our children, and everybody had their phone out, and they were doing it. And I thought, oh, they put their phones away. I thought they were texting and all that stuff. They weren't. They were reading the scriptures because they have the Bible app in their phone, and I have it in mine, and it helps. And the nice thing about it, in my app, I can put almost any version of the Bible in that text. And so as a matter of fact, the text for this coming Sunday, which we're starting a new series on priming the pump, which is going to carry us through Lent, in it, I made sure that she put the Good News translation in because it uses the word that I wanted. The others say the same thing, but they have a different word for it. So I put it heaven. So this coming Sunday, you will see the scripture will be written from the Good News translation. Who has Kings 22:8? Anybody?
2 Kings?
Do what?
2 Kings 22:8?
2 Kings 22:8. You got it?
Yeah.
Read it.
One day Hilkiah the high priest went to Shaphan the secretary and exclaimed, I have discovered a scroll in the temple with God's laws written on it. He gave the scroll to Shaphan to read.
Did you realize what comes out of all this? When you think about it, and Mark brings it out in his book, it's hard to imagine someone that was young holding on to such an exalted position as we find out that some of them are in, as Josiah, who was a king, all right? He was king at 8 years old. Did you know that? But all of a sudden they found this in the drawer, this old Torah that was there, and it found out, and they found the greatest inspiration for a king. And he says, this is the very temple, when you think about where he found it in a drawer, I'm sure he didn't go what he said. His mother-in-law said, go to the west cupboard. You know? So anyway, you're going to find that out anyway when you read it all. But anyway, here we are. The entire nation and the king were also in such desperate need. This was the king of Judah, all right? And here he was having all of this, and he comes and finds out that he has this answer for him, and he's found it there. And here it is. Well, what was he found? Do you know what it was? It was Deuteronomy. And all of a sudden, it was an inspiration. It was the book of law. And that's what Deuteronomy really is. And the name they give it then, it sounds, it's uninspiring to say Deuteronomy, isn't it? Yeah. We're trying to think of something that would be more inspiring for us to do that. But did you know that there are other stories that are linked to Deuteronomy? Did you know that?
That there are other stories that what?
Are linked to Deuteronomy. For instance, if someone wants to look, I'll read it for you, but Nehemiah. You ever read much of it? Nehemiah? Oh, yeah, I've read some of it. The 8th chapter, the 1st to 3rd verse says this. Of all the people gathered as one man at the square, which was in front of the water gate, do you realize they had one of those? They had the first water gate. Do you realize that? And they asked Ezra, all right, you're all familiar with Ezra, right? There's a book about him in there, and we've already read that. The scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. This is in Deuteronomy, all right, which the Lord has given to Israel. Then Ezra, the priest, brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding. I've often wondered about that. Do you ever listen with understanding?
Sometimes.
Are you like me? And Joyce said, did you hear me? And I said, I heard you, but I wasn't listening. And so we have to have understanding, we've got to be listening, all right? He said with understanding. And on the first day of the 7th month, they read from it before the square, which was in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday. Can you imagine sitting in the town square for half a day as someone read from the book of law?
If it felt like manna from heaven, yes.
Do what?
If it felt like manna from heaven, yes.
Yeah.
And
But
that's what it was today.
I can understand our kids with their iPhones sitting there for that time, texting and so forth. But can you imagine people sitting there attentive, being very attentive to Ezra's reading of this for midday, in the presence of men and women, those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the book of law. I don't know how you are, but a book of law at times does not inspire me to want to read, does it you? And so we think of that. So what we think, but the book of Deuteronomy, I think, will change the way you and I think. Also, I think it's going to change the way we believe, and it's going to change. I pray it's going to change the way we live in our lives. It's important for us to think about. Excuse me. The book of Deuteronomy. It convinced a doubting, right, undermotivated generation in life, and it changed them into a force. That they realized I'm giving you a round they look over. They gave it a force. It came the opportune time in their lives to have heart change and to be able to listen to what God is saying to them. So, when we think about it, perhaps God is using the book of Deuteronomy to create a new heart in all of us. I pray, and it beats with, and I like what Mark says, and I pray that it beats with reckless abandon. So we're going to be looking at the following pages, and we'll look at starting with chapter 1. You were born for this, and we're going to look at chapter 1 and think about it. He brings out some inspirations of all this. I have just a couple of minutes of 11. Do y'all want to continue, or you want to go, or you want to call it and start next week on the book, the first chapter of the book of Deuteronomy? Thoughts?
Next week you can give us time to read it.
Yeah.
And all we look at is the first chapter. We're not gonna go delving through all of it, all right? I'll give you time to read that and also read the book and also thoughts on your thoughts on all of this.
Wait a minute, clarification, you want us to read this entire book?
No.
No.
We're gonna go through this entire.
All right, we're going through this one chapter at a time, not Deuteronomy.
No.
So essentially, this was kind of covering the introduction.
Yeah, today was an intro into where we are, because I didn't want us to start us off point blank and start talking about the book of Deuteronomy and the verses that are in it. I want us to think about, I think the title is what we need to be. The title is, if you'll see, it says, "You were born for this." You ever think about that you were? And then really get up when you get up in the morning, your first thought is, Lord, I was born for this. Then we go through it, you know. But we're thinking about it. And what I want us to look at this is think on what he is marking. Because I like what he says. He says, I studied Deuteronomy in Colorado while peering at the Rockies. You ever peered at the Rockies?
Absolutely.
I peered at the Rockies, but I didn't study. I was enamored with the beauty of it all. I'd be sitting there looking at it all. But I can understand the motivation. I can understand saying that he was writing this and he was fascinated by it. And he said, and of course, fascinated with God's creation, and you can't help but look at it and realize that, all right? But even more inspired to see that God put this book into the Bible to unleash generation after generation with reckless abandon. And that's where I want to, I hope that when we finish this course, and it's going to be a short one because there's only 12 chapters in this book, and they're short, easy reads. Yeah, there's 12 chapters. It'll take us through that and then maybe a little further. But I want us to think about where we are and what transpired and what makes us have reckless abandonment in our faith and move forward.
Brother Rob,
Yes.
when you introduce this, we always, I do at least, read between the lines and say, that's what Brother Bob's thinking. He's read this, that's what he's thinking, and he's, you're wanting to share that with us. When I read what it was, I haven't read the whole book, but when I read what it was, it's like everything else that comes from the Word, it's so pertinent to today, whether you're in John or whether you're in Deuteronomy. And as a person of a certain age, which I'm not alone in, there seems to be a certain urgency to figure something out. And I love the way that the figuring it out takes us to the relationship. And even though it's Deuteronomy, and none of us think, oh boy, Deuteronomy, that's going to be just like John. I'm going to be a happy person and a full heart, that even though it's Deuteronomy, it goes straight to the heart of the relationship. And Josiah, or all the things that happen in Deuteronomy are just a way of seeing that again, which of course the Word is eternal. So it's a great place to be right now. And reckless abandon is just one way to put how we need to renew and revive and energize and go forward in a situation at a time where that doesn't seem perfectly timed, but God's timing is right. It will turn out to be right. So good choice, thank you.
Well, we'll order some more books. Who needs books? You do. Goldie, I think Brenda said one of them was supposed to be for you, but I'll get you one. We're going to order some more. Or those of you who would like to, you can put them on, you go online like Lisa has, and she has it on ebook. And you can get it for ebook for $6. Where you have to pay $16 for it. But I'm one of these individuals that I want it in my hand. I want to hold it. And that's the reason I enjoy novels. I want to read the
Well, I like, because it's on my phone.
Oh,
If
yeah.
I only have my phone with me, I have 15 minutes to see something. Plus, you can also do that.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about the phone. And you can probably do that with your iPad too.
Yeah, absolutely. I've tried to do that on magazines one day and I went, wait.
True.
Well, anyway, we're gonna start next week on chapter 1, which will be the book, this book, which will be the first chapter of and as you read it, and you find out in Deuteronomy 1, and he makes references to it, and things that are going on there. But there's gonna be other areas as we go through, that we're gonna look into others. The end of each chapter are a group of questions that he wrote this in a manner so that it can be used as a small group, all right? And you're gonna find, it's gonna list it as small group discussion. It's a small group, right? And so it's gonna ask you questions. I want you to think about it. Next week, and one of the questions, the very first question is, what has been a movie that has been the most motivational for you and why? So as you go through those questions, after you read the chapter and read of Deuteronomy and put your things together and look at those questions he has at the end of the chapter, I want to hear your answers from it. I'm going to have my own, all right? But I want to hear yours because I think it's important for us to be able to discuss that. Because it's going to be interesting to see. To me, I want to know what was the most, what might be motivational for you as a movie was not for me, but, I want to hear that. But what that does is it brings us into our lives together. And it's important for that. But Sue, I'm not preaching from this. I'm serious. I'm not preaching. I'm not preaching with what we do. Of course, I would like to say this thing, but I'm not. Excuse me.
Your general direction for quite some time has been a little more urgent about our growth, our application of the word, our strength in prayer and all those things, so it all fits together for me.
Well, you realize where you are right now, where the church is, where Mapleville Methodist is an opportune time to us start in stepping out. I moved in a direction, I'm working in 2 different directions, that I hear Blair Ragsville written all over them when I get into them, because Blair had a way of pulling us out of our box. And so I think there's some opportunities for us as a church to do some things.
What, since you brought that up, I want to bring up the idea of working with CEF. It's a younger group. The lady that's in charge is younger and more energetic, and I am slowing visibly minute by minute. We want to find a time between now and Easter to simply invite young people, and we're talking about, up through 12-year-olds. We're not talking about 16-year-olds necessarily, but to come to our church to visit with us, and it's evangelism. And
Janelle called me and she would like us to have, like we had the Christmas one, but have an Easter one. It doesn't have to be on Easter.
No.
It could be in the Lenten season.
spring break's a good time to do it.
We had a pretty good turnout, but thanks to our friend over here, Ryan, Lowe, bringing most of the children to us that day. But you realize there's work to be done, excuse me, because Janelle went to all the neighborhoods around us and made 100 pamphlets out to people. We had what, 6, 8? But that's 6, 8 more than one. It's sort of like one by said, one is enough if we've been successful. But that's
We didn't have anybody that actually came from the neighborhood.
No.
Not one
Not
person
one person.
of those people came.
Could I therefore ask that, at least this group, please, would you be in prayer for our ability to just